To examine these issues and more, I'm joined by former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, live from London. Thanks for joining us again, Alexander. You must be disturbed by what's happened with these journalists and what it says about China's attitude to Australia.
Yes, I'm quite shocked by it. The fact that, by all accounts, these journalists were called on by officers of the Ministry of State Security in the middle of the night, at like midnight, to be questioned is extremely intimidating. I mean, if they just wanted to ask them some questions, they could have called on them in a normal time during the working day, but to call on them at midnight is a very bad sign, is quite intimidating. And I think DFAT have, by the way, done an excellent job to have got the two of them out of China as successfully as they have. But this is a new low in the bilateral relationship between Australia and China.
Well, DFAT, of course, have had to hide the journalists, protect them at the embassy and at the consulate in Shanghai. Then they've had to negotiate with China to get them out of the country and fly them home. They're obviously deeply concerned about their safety. No one seriously would think either of these journalists are involved in anything subversive. Does it suggest that we worry, that our Department of Foreign Affairs is worried that China is effectively using Australian journalists as political hostages?
Well, I think that they're just cracking down on reporting, presumably. I mean, the Australian journalists, I suppose, do what journalists always do, and they ring around people to get stories and corroborate information and all the usual kinds of things. I mean, neither of those journalists has a record for being particularly outrageous or controversial or xenophobic or anything like that. And it's not enough. It's not good enough, apparently, for the Chinese leadership. And look, what you've seen here is a huge change in the way China has engaged with the rest of the world. It's decided it's going to begin cutting itself off diplomatically from the rest of the world through behaving like this. I mean, you mentioned it in your editorial at the beginning. They're not picking up the phone and answering calls from Australian ministers. Simon Birmingham, the trade minister, has spoken about that. They're not talking to the foreign minister or other ministers. And the sort of no-speaky stuff we kind of remember from primary school, it gets you nowhere. It gets you nowhere. If they have differences with Australia, why don't they sit down and talk about them? Listen to the Australian side and try to understand, and for their part, explain their position. But what they do is they get their diplomats to go out and make sort of incredibly rude, offensive, and sometimes quite preposterous statements about our leaders who, the curious thing about our country is that we elect our leaders. So these are people who represent our people in a liberal democracy. They have, this is wolf warrior diplomacy. They have become extremely aggressive. But you see, in the end, for every action, there is a reaction. And the reaction in liberal democratic countries is for them to rally together. And that's why I say by behaving in this sort of way, the Chinese leadership are increasingly starting to isolate themselves.
Do you believe there's any risk for Australian diplomats in China?
I assume not. It would be very abnormal behaviour but kicking journalists or harassing journalists in the middle of the night and having had them to be expedited out of the country by diplomats is in and of itself extraordinary behaviour. But I think for the Chinese to start harassing our diplomats and in particular detaining our diplomats, though, that would be one step that even they would take, I would assume.
So Australia's response, though, should be to continue to press for openness, to continue to press for dialogue, for visits, for conversations?
Yes, I mean, Australia should. I think the Australian government has actually behaved in an exemplary way in dealing with these provocations from China. I mean, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Trade Minister, they don't lose their tempers. They are not abusive. They don't denigrate the personalities who rule China. They've been very calm, but they haven't tried to engage with China, and the Chinese leadership have refused to engage. No. I mean, you just have to let them as time goes on, work out that this kind of diplomacy is just never going to advance China's national interest. It's never going to be good for China's position in the world. So I'm in London, and I was listening to the BBC News at 7:30 London time this morning, so about 40 minutes ago. And this story of the Australian journalist is one of the lead stories on the BBC News. I mean, that's 67 million people in the UK. This sort of thing is spreading around the world, and it's not being reported from China's perspective in a favourable way. It's people around the world, and particularly around the democratic world, are just alarmed by what they're doing, and it's making them look aggressive, dictatorial, and it is making them increasingly isolated.
Indeed. Now, just before I let you go, an issue directly related to Australia. I don't know whether you caught up with Tony Abbott while he's in London, but a former Prime Minister...
I did, yeah. I had a drink with him.
I thought you might have. Obviously, you're going to support him taking this job. Is he on Australia's side or England's side? And what about some of the criticism, the vicious lies that have been thrown at him in Britain?
Well, he'll always be on Australia's side, but, he will be able to give them some advice on this board of trade. It's an advisory board. He'll be able to, he along with some others on the board of trade, will be able to give them some advice on free trade negotiations and how best to conduct those negotiations. And he has a lot of experience. He was the Prime Minister whose government landed the free trade agreement, well, with the aforementioned China, but also with Japan and South Korea. These were huge achievements for any government. So there's been an attack on him from the political left, who attack him because he's a conservative. And in particular, Tony Abbott is a social conservative. I mean, this is just part of the cancel culture at work, that you can't use your expertise on trade to advise a board of trade because of your attitude on same-sex marriage, or because your political opponent stood up in Parliament and called you a misogynist. I pointed out in the media here in the UK, the British Minister for Trade is a woman called Liz Truss. Yes, that's it. She's a woman, and she appointed him. So I think she's a better judge of whether he's a misogynist than plenty of the men who have been criticising him for being a misogynist.
Good point.
And I've met with Liz Truss, and she's very happy with him, and is a good friend of his.
Thanks for joining us, Alexander. And I told you the Crows would get at least one win this year.
One win. It was. I mean, when you're not winning at all, then one win against Hawthorn is just such an exciting moment.
You'll take it. Thanks for joining us, Alexander Downer there, live from London.